The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Peter approached Jesus and asked him, Lord, if my brother sins against me, how often must I forgive? As many as 7 times? Jesus answered, I say to you, not 7 times, but 77 times. That is why the kingdom of heaven may be likened to a king who decided to settle accounts with his servants. When he began the accounting, a debtor was brought before him who owed him a huge amount. Since he had no way of paying it back, his master ordered him to be sold along with his wife, his children, and all his property in payment of the debt. At that, the servant fell down, did him homage, and said, Be patient with me, and I will pay you back in full. Moved with compassion, the master of that servant let him go and forgave him the loan. When that servant had left, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him a much smaller amount. He seized him and started to choke him, demanding, Pay back what you owe. Falling to his knees, his fellow servant begged him, Be patient with me, and I will pay you back. But he refused. Instead, he had his fellow servant put in prison until he paid back the debt. Now, when his fellow servants saw what had happened, they were deeply disturbed, and they went to their master and reported the whole affair. His master summoned him and said to him, You wicked servant, I forgave you your entire debt because you begged me to do so. Should you not have had pity on your fellow servant just as I had on you? Then in anger, his master handed him over to the torturers until he should pay back the whole debt. So will my heavenly Father do to you, unless each of you forgives your brother from the heart. The Gospel of the Lord. Perhaps it's no coincidence that this very challenging and hard gospel passage comes to us in this octave, this period, this week of September 11th. And you see the banner on the baptismal font there, remembering September 11th. And on the top of the font there is a piece of steel recovered from the remains of the September 11th attacks. And it's a heavy piece of steel from the World Trade Center. Feel free to pick it up and just lift it. And it's small, but just feel how heavy it is. So that piece of steel and this piece of World Trade Center steel shaped into a cross was given to me by a friend in Rockville Center who lost her husband, an FDNY battalion chief who was going up Tower 2 on that fateful day in 2001. So the weight of that and this smaller piece of steel is amazing. Small, but very heavy. And if you multiply that by 100 plus floors cascading down to ground zero 22 years ago, just imagine, we all know that horrible day. The connection that I would like to suggest is that it's a small piece of steel, but is really heavy for its size. A small thing can weigh us down, and it's the same way with unforgiveness. A small thing, a small memory, a small situation of the past or recent can, weigh us down, cascading into a personal or a family or a communal national mess for years. And so in today's gospel parable reading of the merciful King, the Master, twice we find the plea, be patient with me and I will pay you back in full. The first time it's pronounced by the servant who owes this master an enormous amount. Today would be like millions of dollars. So it's like a heavy piece of steel surrounding his life. How is this guy ever going to get out of this deep rut, debt that he's in? The second time, it's repeated by another servant of the same master. He too is in debt, not towards his master, but towards the same servant who had just had this enormous debt remitted. But this debt was very small, maybe a week's worth of wages, scripture scholars tell us. So the heart of the parable is this indulgence, this mercy that the master, that the king shows towards his servant with the bigger debt. And so St. Matthew underlines those words, moved with compassion. The master let him go and forgave him the loan. An enormous debt, therefore, a huge remission. But that servant, as we heard, just immediately goes out afterwards, and he showed himself to be who he was, a pitiless, harsh, hard-hearted person towards his companion who owed him this modest amount in comparison to what he himself owed. He doesn't listen to him, he throttles him by the neck, he's hostile to him, and has him thrown into prison. So the master hears the story, outraged, he calls him and condemns him. I forgave you totally, and you're not capable, you're not willing of letting it go and forgiving so little for what all that you have been forgiven for? So in this parable, challenging parable for all of us, we find two different attitudes. God's attitude, represented by the king, the master, who forgives a lot, because God always forgives, or as Pope Francis always says, God is, the name for God is mercy. And the human person's puny response. For him, sometimes, many times perhaps for us. The divine attitude is justice, yes, pervaded with mercy. Whereas the human attitude is limited often to justice alone. On the front of the bulletin, front cover of the bulletin is an image, a meme, of a license plate of a car from, let's say, a fictitious state. A fictitious state that doesn't yet exist in our country or our world. Let's call it the state of mercy. And the license plate is, you are forgiven. You are forgiven. Jesus exhorts us to open ourselves with courage to the strength of forgiveness, because in life, not everything can be resolved with justice alone. We know this. There's a need for that merciful love, which is also at the basis of Jesus' response to Peter's question, how often should I forgive? And Peter thinks he's being magnanimous. 7 times, I'll do it. But Jesus says no, 77 times. In the symbolic language of the Bible, this means that we're called to forgive always. Not an easy task. So how much suffering, how many wounds, how many wars could be avoided if forgiveness and mercy were the style, the bottom line of our lives? Even in families, especially in families, how many families are disunited, who don't know how or refuse to forgive each other? I know I have it in my family, perhaps you have it in yours. How many brothers and sisters bear resentment within for a long time? It's necessary to apply merciful love to all human relationships, but we know that it is not easy. Between spouses, between parents and children, within our commitments, within our communities, within our church, within our society, and of course, more than ever, in politics, obviously. The phrase in the first reading from the book of Sirach stands out today. It says, remember your end and stop hating. A challenging phrase. The author says, think about the end, meaning death. Just think. You'll be in a coffin. We'll be in a coffin or an urn. And will it take your hatred? Will you take your hatred, unforgiveness, to the grave? Will pallbearers be able to carry the casket into the church because it's still as heavy as World Trade Center steel? And so Sirach says, don't just think about this moment. And the second reading from Paul to the Romans is the standard reading used at every funeral. Think about where unforgiveness will lead us. Try to stop hating. Wrath and anger, Sirach says, are hateful things, and yet sometimes we hug them tightly. Remember your last days and set enmity aside. So, Jesus tells us, better to forgive as we have been forgiven. Pope Francis says, interestingly, about this particular parable that we hear in every church throughout the world today, he says that resentment often returns, and he uses this image like a bothersome fly in the summer that keeps coming back and swirling, hovering over us. And he says that forgiveness isn't something that we do in a moment, in a second. It's something continuous against that resentment, that hatred that often keeps coming back. And so this parable helps us to understand what we say perhaps every day, certainly at every Mass, in the Our Father, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. These words contain a decisive truth, because we can't demand God's forgiveness for ourselves if we in turn refuse to grant forgiveness to the family member, to the neighbor, to the coworker, whoever it might be. It's the human condition, like a heavy steel in our hearts that's bothersome, that keeps coming back, and we're invited every time we come to Mass, at the beginning of the Mass, to think about our failings and to ask God to lift us, to take this pain away to our work, our action of trying to be a Christian. Maybe it's also no coincidence that this parable begins on the high holy days of Judaism, a new year, a new time leading up to the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. And it sort of reminds me that forgiveness isn't just a Christian thing. It's certainly a Judeo-Christian thing from the book of Sirach, the Old Testament, but it's also a human race necessity. There's a story in the bulletin about the Olma family in Poland during World War II, Catholic family in Poland, who brought in a Jewish family to protect them from the Nazis. And the Nazis came, they killed the Jewish family, and then they executed the Olma family, the parents and their 7 children, one in utero. Perhaps you read about it in Newsday over the past week. The beatification took place in Poland last Sunday. This is the first time in history that an entire family was beatified by the church. And Pope Francis calls them martyrs, models, and martyrs of evangelical love. There's also another story that I came upon that took place just a few years ago after the Olma family were executed. And so in 1945, as the Nazi regime was begun to be defeated, tens of thousands of women and children were imprisoned in this place called the Ravensbrück concentration camp. They were slaughtered or they were forced to a death march, and an estimated 40,000 people perished. And so the following prayer was found on a note shortly after that near the body of a slain child. And this is how the prayer goes. O Lord, remember not only the men and women of goodwill, but also those of ill will. But do not remember all the sufferings they have inflicted upon us. Remember the fruits that we have found because of this suffering, our comradeship, our loyalty, our humility, our courage, our generosity, the greatness of heart that has grown out of all this And when they come to judgment, let all the fruits we have borne be their forgiveness. Amen. Withholding forgiveness is like the weight of steel, pushing us down further into the dust. And so as we come together for Mass today, our prayer to God is, be patient with me. Be patient with me and allow me to be as patient, as understanding, as forgiving as possible. Forgiveness is the most challenging work of human beings, but it comes with the greatest reward, the peace of God. Trying to move ourselves into the region, into the state of mercy, branded with the label, you are forgiven. Those who have suffered the most are often the greatest teachers in the practice of forgiveness.